We've just seen the pivot method to reshape data frames. Now we are going to learn how to use another method, the pivot table. As we mentioned before, the pivot method has some limitations. Let's remember a previous example. The values for name and variable are the same, but the value for imperial system is different. So when we try to apply the pivot method, it fails. The pivot method is a great general-purpose pivoting technique. However, it requires the index column pair to be unique. This is mainly due to the fact that pivot method cannot aggregate values. What do we do in those cases, like the one from the previous example? Pandas provide us with another method, the pivot table method. A pivot table is a data frame that contains statistics that summarizes the data from a larger data frame. To convert from this data frame in long format to this data frame with aggregated values, we can use the pivot table method, as you see on the slide. And it's important to notice that with this method, we can also summarize data frames that are not in long format. This method takes several arguments. The index argument takes the name of the column we want to have as an index in the new pivoted data frame. And the columns argument takes the name of the column we want to have as each column in the new data frame, similar to what we saw for the pivot method. The values argument takes the name of the column which values we want to aggregate in the new pivoted data frame. In this case, we can also specify an aggregation function. If we omit this value, pandas will understand you want to take their average. But it's always a good practice to clarify which function we want. So, in our previous example, we could now apply the pivot table method. We set name as the index, variable as the columns, and we specify we want the mean. Now the method works perfectly. For the row with repeated index column pair, we can observe the mean of the original values. Another advantage of pivot tables is that we can have multi-level indexes. To clarify this, we'll work with the following dataset. We'll apply the pivot table step by step. We set the column movement as columns. Then we pass a list of columns to the index, the columns first and last. Finally, we pass the columns overall and attacking as the values we want to aggregate. And we specify we want to get their maximum value. As you can observe in the slide, we get a pivoted data frame with multi-level index not only in the columns but also in the rows, the indexes first and last. Finally, we would like to get the number of attacking and overall scores each player has. In the pivot table method, we omit passing the values argument. This tells pandas to pivot all values. But we'll pass the margins argument. When this parameter is set to true, all the columns and rows will be added. In our case, we'll get the total count for each row and column. How do we know if we should apply pivot or pivot table? Ask yourself, does the data frame have more than one value for each index column pair? Do I need a multi-level index or a summary statistics of a large data frame? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then you should use pivot table. Now it's time to use pivot tables.